My lords, ladies and gentlemen, Milton Friedman would have been 100 later this month, and I wish he were here so that we could celebrate that 100th birthday with him. When Lord Saatchi invited me to speak to you this evening, I assumed it was because I had one or two things in common with Milton Friedman. Not his intellect, but we were both fellows of the Hoover Institution. And when I was invited to become a fellow, for me the great attraction was that Milton Friedman was a fellow already. I've also made a small contribution to writing on inflation. But that's not, in fact, why Lord Saatchi invited me to be here. He invited me to be here, I suspect, because I also have in common with Milton Friedman an enthusiasm for the low pursuit of journalism. In addition to being, as Deepak Lal has pointed out, one of the great economists, if not the greatest economist of the 20th century, Milton Friedman was also a regular presenter on PBS, the American equivalent of the BBC. Free to Choose was a 10-part series that aired in the late 70s. And he wrote a column for Newsweek for an astonishing 18 years. I have lapsed into writing for Newsweek myself of late. So I guess the idea is that I now say some words about Milton Friedman, the public intellectual, as Americans say, or the hack, as we like to say here in Britain. In the world of hackery, it's extremely fashionable today to say that the financial crisis has proved Milton Friedman wrong. You can read that on an almost weekly basis in the New York Times or The Guardian, or if anybody still reads it, The Independent. It is extremely hazardous to say in public that anything has proved Milton Friedman wrong. An illustration of this point was made even before the financial crisis by none other than Paul Krugman, who wrote a long, double-edged piece in the New York Review of Books, in which he argued that monetarism had been comprehensively disproved by the fact that the Federal Reserve and other central banks had moved from targeting automatically, so to speak, the growth of broad money to discretionary monetary policy of the sort Milton Friedman had been against. And Krugman remarked with considerable satisfaction the huge success that the Federal Reserve had enjoyed with this discretionary monetary policy under Alan Greenspan clearly falsified Milton Friedman's theory. It should be said that subsequent events did not treat this article kindly, since if one wanted to point to a single cause of the great real estate bubble that ultimately triggered the financial crisis, one would point to the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan when discretionary policy replaced a monetary target. So it's very risky to say that Milton was wrong. And I'm here to remind you of how many things he was right about, which haven't yet been mentioned. His very earliest work, published work, I think, was against rent control at a time when rent control was universally believed to be a good and wonderful thing. I had the great privilege of lunching with the Burmese opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi just a few days ago. In addition to being a most charming and charismatic person, you all know this, she turned out to agree entirely with Milton Friedman on the subject of rent control, having for a time, through her in-laws, been a modest landlord in the Oxford area. That's just one of many examples I could cite. When I was trying to explain to my students at Harvard what the Fed was likely to do when the financial crisis got going in late 2008, I said the simplest thing to do is to read Friedman and Schwartz's chapter, The Great Contraction, in the monetary history of the United States, and assume that the Fed will do the exact opposite. And so it proved. Indeed, there's been almost no better guide to Fed policy than that great work. Deepak Lal has brilliantly, and I think it was brilliant, Deepak, elucidated the profound distinction between Friedman's thought on money and the erroneous theory of credit expansion, which has come to dominate the Fed and other economic theorists in our time. So I won't revisit that. But I will revisit perhaps the single most important sentence that Milton Friedman ever published. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I still remember vividly, as if it were yesterday, the shiver that ran down my spine when I read those words for the first time. I was a graduate student sitting in a library in Hamburg, trying to write a PhD about the German hyperinflation. And Milton proved an invaluable guide in those days. But you see, he wasn't just an economist. And it's not just his insights at that high level that should influence us today. He generated an idea a week. And in almost every case, those ideas turn out to have been right. He was a consistent opponent of farm subsidies and tariffs, a passionate believer in free trade. He was against state intervention in the form of conscription. One forgets too easily the part he played in the creation of the all-volunteer force out of the wreck of the draft army that had lost the Vietnam War. Milton Friedman was an early and passionate advocate of voucher schemes to create choice, to create freedom in education. He was a forceful and justified critic of American public schools long before it was fashionable to point out that they no longer were very good, and indeed failed, in particular, the poorest families in American society. Confronted with the problem of pollution long before anybody had heard of Al Gore or the phrase climate change, it was Friedman who argued in his columns and elsewhere that a system of emissions permits was preferable to crude state control of industry. When one looks at the list of positions that Milton Friedman adopted as a public intellectual or hack, the striking thing is that he was nearly always right. Initially reviled, seen as a crank, ultimately vindicated because his policies were adopted. Only perhaps in his campaign for a legalization of drugs has he so far been unsuccessful. But I want to emphasize so far, because if one thing is clear to me, it is that ultimately the United States will have to admit defeat in its misnamed war on drugs as surely as it abandoned prohibition in the 1930s. But we must not, as we celebrate Milton Friedman's 100th birthday, overlook what will seem to many on the left as the slam dunk proposition, that Milton Friedman was wrong about deregulation and wrong about allowing businessmen to pursue profit and only profit as the sole form of social responsibility they should take. I'm sure Milton would approve of me quoting from an iPhone because there's no better illustration of what the free market can produce than this handy gadget. And I want to just read to you a quotation that you may well see in print when somebody tries to prove Milton Friedman wrong this week. The question is, do corporate executives have responsibilities in their business activities other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible? My answer to that is no, they do not. This was from an article published in 1970 in, of all places, the New York Times Magazine. And presumably there will be somebody, perhaps writing in the New York Times, perhaps even named Paul Krugman, who will seize the opportunity presented to him by the calamities of the financial sector on both sides of the Atlantic to say, aha, here truly Friedman was wrong. But I didn't read you the full quotation, ladies and gentlemen. I deliberately abridged it in the way that I suspect it often is abridged. Here's what he in fact wrote. The question is, do corporate executives, provided they stay within the law, have responsibilities in their business activities other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible? That is, I think you will agree at this a time of crisis, a rather important qualification. Milton Friedman understood not only the benefits of free markets, but like Adam Smith, he understood the failings of businessmen, the shortcomings of capitalists as a class. I want to quote another wonderful Friedman observation that one doesn't hear often enough, from an article, or rather a lecture, from 1983 entitled "The Suicidal Impulse of the Business Community." The broader and more influential organizations of businessmen have acted to undermine the basic foundation of the free market system they purport to represent and defend. It's reminiscent of that great passage in The Wealth of Nations when Smith points out that the natural impulse of business is in fact to collude against the public. And this brings us back to where Lord Saatchi began this session. It is not the teaching of Milton Friedman any more than it was the teaching of Adam Smith that one should just leave the bankers to it and give them a free rein. On the contrary, the real wisdom of Friedman's work lay in his capacity to see the perils as well as the opportunities of a lightly regulated free market. One last thought, which seems to me highly apposite. As the world rushes to create regulation upon regulation upon regulation in the belief that it was a lack of regulation that caused the financial crisis. One of the great mistakes, Milton Friedman wrote, is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. In my experience, the left nearly always can claim to have good intentions. It nearly always has disastrous results. And Milton Friedman spent his entire career as an economist and as a public intellectual pointing out how disastrous those results could be. Thanks very much.